I'm very pleased to introduce to you our final conference speaker and the second keynote of the conference, my colleague and friend, Dr. Dorothy Williams. Dorothy holds a doctorate from McGill University. She's a historian of the Black community in Montreal and has written two books on this topic. Blacks in Montreal, 1628 to 1986, an Urban Demography, and The Road to Now, A History of Blacks in Montreal. In addition, she volunteers for numerous community organizations such as the DaCosta Angélique Institute and the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. We have Dorothy with us for an hour today. She will speak and then we'll have time for questions. Dorothy's keynote is called You Don't Have a History, Passion as the Counter-Narrative of History, Heritage, and Archives. And I apologize for the cat running across the screen, which is inevitable at a conference like this. So without further ado, Dorothy, we look forward to your keynote.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to talk with you today about a subject that I usually share only with my friends or close confidants. Where I am today and the work I'm doing stems from a lifelong passion to uncover who I am as a Black Canadian woman. I don't say this lightly. Through my 40 years in academia, there's been very little that gave me context for being here. Most Blacks growing up in Canada have little they see and hear that speaks about them. My research and writing over the years have taken me into nooks and crannies of Canadian history that you nor I have never heard of, but I won't reveal any of them today. I'm not an immigrant, neither were my parents nor their parents. My family's roots predate Confederation, and in Quebec, we have sojourned for about 5 generations. I'm a Quebecer, call me a Quebecois if you will, it doesn't matter to me. This is my home too. My roots are in the southwest of the island, straddling communities of Little Burgundy, St. Henry, Point St. Charles, and Verdun. I'm a Southwest girl, though to many Blacks in other boroughs, I'm simply from downtown. The early years of my youth were prior to the immigration explosion that began in the mid-1960s. In Little Burgundy, we were part of a small community of about 6,000. Growing up, I was not isolated by history because it was part of the fabric of my family and life in that district. Memories were shared orally and came out of a need to make the present more understandable. Now, today we call it genealogy, but growing up in that small knit community, understanding your family relationships was almost a daily occurrence. If you brought a friend home, the conversation revolved around how so-and-so was related to you, or how my new friend's great aunt, twice removed, got a job in some obscure business or something like that, decades before we were even born. It was all very annoying, but I too must have annoyed the adults because that was due to my innate curiosity. I would ask where we came from and where did we live before and who I was related to. Family memories go back to my grandmother, who remembers her grandmother was a slave in Nova Scotia. For any of you who may not know, Canada had over 200 years of slavery that ended August 1st, 1834. So from my family, I got a real grounding about who I was and where I fit in Canada. Unlike many of my new West Indian friends, my family stories were not about immigrating to Canada. They were not about the Caribbean or the United States. They were about Montreal, with old memories of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Unlike many of my new West Indian friends, my family stories were not about immigrating to Canada. They were not about the Caribbean or the United States. They were about Montreal with old memories of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, but always ultimately Montreal. Still, I learned something along the way about continuity and our relationship to the city. And then there were times when the adult conversation in the room turned to some incident when so-and-so fought against a racist obstacle or the occasional skirmish that turned physical. As a youngster, I didn't understand the looks they shared, but I knew there were traces of a lifetime of facing many battles. Despite this lineage, my sense of belonging has always been questioned by non-Blacks. Where do you come from? Is a familiar query I often tackle, usually in the first 5 minutes. Fair enough. With the exception of First Nations people, aren't we all from somewhere else? It is disconcerting that Montreal was rarely a sufficient response. But where were you born? Or where does your family come from? These questions indicate to them that I'm either foreign, non-Quebec stock, or as some politicians would say, part of les autres. So what makes me as different or foreign? What do they see or hear in those first 5 minutes? Do they hear an accent? I don't have one. Perhaps it's the way I dress. You can spot a tourist on St. Catherine Street by their clothes. I don't dress that differently, though. I will admit to being fashion challenged. Maybe it's my family name. After all, Williams is very English. Still, I don't think it's my name. Rather, given some of the testier exchanges I've had, it must be because of the color of my skin. Ah, brown skin, a Black woman, clearly not from here. Yet, how wrong and how destructive that assumption is, because though many white Quebecers still perceive Black Quebecers as other, many Blacks are actually old stock. Their ancestors may have been here when Parliament burned, before the Durham Report, before the conscription crisis, during the Prohibition vote, and they may have even voted in the election of Borden or Maurice Duplessis. It has been my mission over 4 decades to challenge that assumption by revealing the role Blacks played in Quebec since New France. Like you, this fact was not one I learned in school. Rather, my awareness of the Black community came through a long process of internalization I just shared with you. And once that salient truth crystallized for me, it became an object of my focus, or what some would call my passion. My talk today is really to walk you along the journey I have taken in my life, one that exemplifies my passion. So, where did my focus, my passion start as an academic pursuit? Strangely enough, in preparation for this talk, I have given that some thought and was finally able to pin it down to grade 4. I had always been an avid reader. By grade 4, I was rarely without a book. We had a year-end history test based on key topics throughout the textbook. I took the teacher's challenge and over 2 days read the entire history book. I thought it was fun and aced the test. I reveled in my accomplishment and wanted to know more. In those days, of course, Black Canadian history was never talked about, and the textbook focus was on British history. Next time history tugged at my heart was at the Negro Community Center. In particular, the student leaders spent many hours passing on the stories of Africa to younger members. I was 14 or 15 years old. This was an electrified time, post Sir George Williams affair, and these students were fervent and on a mission. They understood how powerful the image of Africa was for youth, aching to find themselves evidence of greatness beyond the Jackson Five, Muhammad Ali, or Diana Ross. They captured the glory of ancient Africa, and alongside neighborhood kitchen stories, this history kept me going during those formative years. It was fascinating and empowering. That word empowering is often overused, but like the youth of Black Lives Matter today, Black youth in Montreal, after Sir George Williams, wanted to break the chain of ignorance and to raise aspirations of the youth to come. Perhaps the most significant lesson I took away was that history, a subject that I loved, was actually the story of the conquerors. I became deeply convinced as a teenager that the history of the conquerors was short-sighted history. I could see that history about the Canada I loved was not about me. Blacks had not won. We were invisible. I'm not sure exactly when that idea coalesced, but it was reinforced by my activities in the Afro-Canadian Club at Montreal High School. The Afro-Canadian Club was the first all-Black student club in Montreal. My education at the NCC, coupled with the chatter heard while attending the after-school club, was energizing and revelatory. My friends and I, we sopped up the history they presented, beginning with great civilizations of Africa, the European colonialism, the rape of Africa, the Middle Passage genocide, the depravity of slavery. We debated the lingering legacy of enslavement, and we believed the decolonization of Africa was also our struggle here in Canada. This was heady stuff, not something I would ever learn in a regular high school class. I loved it as much as I loved algebra and biology. African history and the rhetoric around the African liberation movement in Montreal was something that we were all agitating for. We believed that African peoples, though downtrodden at the time, would rise again to the glory that they once had, and once again the world would stand in awe of Africa's splendor. I'm sure all these thoughts were spinning in my fertile mind that fateful day in grade 10, when I asked the history teacher in front of the class why he never talked about slavery in Canada and why Black history is never taught. He told me I had no history. Me, the fifth of 6 generations in this country, did not have a history. He continued that Black history was not down on paper and no one had written about it. Therefore, it didn't exist. And there wasn't really enough history to be taught. My story, that of my own invisibility in the Canadian narrative, began that day, I think, and rarely wavered. That's why when I got to university, I asked historians in my department why they did not teach a course on Montreal slave history. The answer was essentially the same. There isn't anything written. So here's the crux of my talk today. I am a Black female African Canadian historian, impassioned by the need to recover a history that has been made unrecognizable or rendered insignificant. It was like a wave that built over time. The miseducated comments like these gave me a focus. The teachers were wrong. We indeed had a history. But the teachers were right. It wasn't written. I knew then what I wanted to do. I wanted it all down on paper. And in fact, even before I got into university, I had figured out how to put it on paper. I still have my first essay I ever did on a Black Canadian subject, and it was in high school. I realized I have been uncovering the written stories of Canada's Black history since the early 70s. It didn't stop there. Throughout my university studies, I continued to produce more research on Black history. In fact, I can remember only one university course that I could not find any information about Blacks, and that was a survey course on the history of China. Oh well, it was 10 years before researchers had uncovered African totems in the heart of China. Sadly, the dearth of Black professors in the field in Canada meant I had no mentors, and I learned about Black scholars and Black historiography on my own. But I was not deterred. My personal world began to reflect the world that I was exploring. Slowly, my home began to fill with boxes of reports, articles, and reams of data on Blacks in Canada. I think others began to notice, and over the years, they began to send me their documents. These would come unannounced, often in the mail or in packages on my step. One such person was Richard Lord. Mr. Lord has written many hats over the years, worn many hats over the years, but it is perhaps most well known as the vice president of the Quebec Liberal Party. He held that position for years, decades before Dominique Anglade took the reins. He was well known in philanthropic and service sectors. He sat on many boards, including the Atwater Library. He was a man of many firsts, breaking the concrete ceiling on several occasions. And for disclosure purposes, Richard Lord was actually the subject of my master's history thesis. He died about 77 years ago, but decades before he died, he had started ceding his historical papers to my archives. Today, his wife continues to expand his collection with occasional delivery of his files. I was fired up about what I was exploring. So when I got a call from Esmeralda Thornhill, who was working at the Human Rights Commission, I was ready. It was 1983, and the commission was looking for a researcher on Black mobility. Esmeralda had taught me as an undergraduate at Concordia and had encouraged my interest in Quebec Black research. Esmeralda had already paved the way, and I met Muriel Garon in charge of this research. Madame Garon allowed me to design and create my own dream report, and I guess for her, it exceeded even her expectations. I remember cautioning Muriel as a historian that as a historian, I would have to incorporate more than just the past 10 years of lived experience in Quebec. Well, as the research progressed, that justified including so much more than historical demography. I'll pause for a second to describe what is meant by demography. Demography, from the Greek demos, the people, and graph, meaning to write, is about graphing the people, or rather compiling statistics on aggregates and cohorts. Although some people use demography to refer to personal, individual stats, the term usually refers to meaningful data on large groups. Thanks to my growing archival collection, I had an opportunity to demonstrate how the roots of racism had stretched back over the centuries and had affected waves of migration in the city. 6 months later, I had cobbled together scores of documentary evidence ready to show, to reveal the breadth and depths of writings on Blacks in Canada, and in Montreal in particular. It was not enough to cite a fact. I took the time to ensure that each citation of that specific fact was included. The result was that Blacks in Montreal is a perfect primer for Afro-Quebecois literature, with multiple corroborations and cross-references. It is a great foundation for building bibliographies on Blacks in Quebec. You could say I was on a mission. I was fixated on proving there had been written documentation stretching back over hundreds of years. Moreover, I took advantage of my standing and community connections and interviewed many elders about their life experiences. I wanted to corroborate, but better yet, to fill in the gaps from the written record I had uncovered. Finally, I sat down and began to write. 30 days later, a manuscript was done. What a measure of satisfaction, having for the first time shown that Blacks indeed had made a footprint on this province and the city. The Quebec Human Rights Commission was convinced as well that all Montrealers should know what the monograph contained, and they urged its publication. Blacks in Montreal, 1628, 1986, and Urban Demography became book number 4 of the commission series. I concede Urban Demography in the title is a bit cumbersome, but it was descriptive. At the time, I just finished my BA in history, and I knew the book was not history, at least not in the academic formal sense of history. It had been written from the long lens of history, using broad themes that were repeated through each period. Subsequently, though, it's been difficult to convince people that the book is not history. The distinction is ignored. In 1989, the book's publication was a historical moment in the Black community for a couple of reasons. First, it was seminal, the first survey of Blacks in Montreal. Second, it was written from the inside. By that, I mean written by a Black person about the Black community. These were words to be trusted, and people added it to the treasury of oral stories they already possessed. The book told everyone that they had been here. That feeling, that was something I could understand, because you see, I too have never been comfortable with invisibility. However, because of my craft, undoing it became my life's work. I've made it my mission to know who I was and what my community had done. Not everyone has been so lucky or so informed. Most people just take for granted that history taught to them is the only version that is true. The children of color, particularly Black children, they do not question why they are invisible. They just live with the negative fallout of a lack of belongingness that permeates their lives. That is why for the next 10 years or so, long after the book sales petered out, I continued to give lectures, particularly in public schools, usually around February Black History Month. Originally, I thought the interest for my presentations meant that the message had gotten through, but soon I realized I was mistaken. For when I lectured in the schools, I was struck by the lack of African Canadian information our students had. Sure, the students researched Black heroes, but either they were African American or African heroes with little or no immediate relevance to Canada. I'd ask about that absence, but the teacher might just smile apologetically or reply they did not know. This simply cemented my belief that the knowledge about Blacks in Canada, even among the educated class, was in many cases little better than the students. How I knew this to be reality came not simply from one-to-one encounters. I often heard the same when lecturing to adults. Inevitably, somebody would raise their hand and ask, "Why didn't I know this?" Or "How come no one told me?" It's a very personal thing for them that they did not know. Indeed, when I started lecturing about 30 years ago, it was such a challenge for some in the room to hear my presentation, and I have even been called a liar in public. I was not deterred. I was not done. About 1995, Blacks in Montreal went into remainder, and I decided it was time to write that history that I had been itching to do. I was in the midst of doing my first master's and took the opportunity to use interlibrary loans and the best resources of McGill's library system, and my own archives that at this time was bursting at the seams. I had had much to say in the book, Blacks in Montreal. So I used that as my template and fleshed out this new manuscript. The road to now was to have a different purpose than Blacks in Montreal. This new book was to focus upon illuminating the history of Black Montrealers. And while Quebecers still perceive Black as others, I wanted to show that here in this province, our history should not be second class, nor rendered as other or insignificant. It was so important to make people aware of how that community had been established in Montreal. Quebec needed a guide to understanding Blacks in the city in order to read their lived experiences, appreciate their contributions, and see the roots of their community concerns and societal issues. The road to now captured memories while it laid bare the abject Black social conditions perpetuated by socioeconomic effects of racism that doubles our unemployment rate, reduces social mobility, and perpetuates generational inequality. Nothing can erase these historical facts. However, to be honest, the book sets out to refute the belief that there is insufficient literature, not only in Quebec, but in Canada as a whole. Yes, 3 decades later, I continue to beat that drum. For unlike African American studies, Canada is bereft of African Canadian studies. There are some changes on the horizon, but not in Quebec yet, and certainly not at that time. What I did see, even through my graduate work, was a focus on Blacks, but only in the context of immigration or ethnic studies, Caribbean-Canadian relations, or perhaps as a minor on a country on continental Africa. But programs specifically about Blacks in Canada still remained hard to find. In the road to now, I was far more explicit about this issue. Part of the reason for my pointedness then was by the time I had begun writing The Road to Now, I had recognized the power of the historian. Historians are very powerful people. You must be kind to historians. If they don't like you or don't see you or hear you, they can very easily erase you. Don't be skeptical. Don't laugh. They erased me. Not just as a Black person, but as a woman, though feminist historians are working hard to reinsert themselves into the narrative. 50 years after the feminist revolution, it can still be a tough slog. So, in The Road to Now, I elaborated while explaining to the reader the fire that lights my passion, the counter-narrative I was aiming for. The following are excerpts from that book in 1997. The first excerpt's from page 13, quoting, "Quebec did not create distinct communities for Blacks within the province. Blacks were never included in Quebec's historical record. Blacks remained invisible population in Montreal, with few references to Blacks in Quebec's historical documents." I continued on page 15. The historian also empowers through the recording of different voices, different narratives. With the available recording technology, it would be remiss of any historian not to tap the living stories of people who lived through periods being researched. This is the time to investigate, for soon those voices will be silenced and we will wonder and speculate. Montreal Blacks share their own 350 years of history. What sets them apart from Montrealers of European descent is their African heritage and experience of slavery. The institution of slavery strips slaves of their connections to land, tribe, clan, or village. With few exceptions, no vestige of this heritage remains, not our names, language, or customs. I had to stress the point about belonging, and so in that same paragraph, I pushed this point on page 15. As a person of African descent, all of Africa, anywhere, could have been my home among many of the 60 or more nations in 1,700 languages. As an Afro-Canadian, I claim it all. It is what binds Africans in the diaspora together under all the trappings of skin color, hairstyles, mother tongue, and social and occupational status. Therefore, Blacks who have arrived for the last 20 or 30 years share 350-year history that is as much theirs as the African Canadian family whose roots can be traced to New France. For some of you who've heard some of my early lectures, you will have no doubt heard the following or something like it. Because then I often finish my speeches with this quote pulled from my book. We know, as part of the African diaspora, the history of Blacks in Montreal is the history of all Blacks in Montreal. There is no break in our continuity. We were here, we are here, and as long as one Black citizen calls it home, Montreal will be our history, end quote. So, in the introduction to The Road to Now, I had already told the world why I wrote. This is why I continue to write. The word Montreal could be substituted for any Black settlement in the country, but you know I was writing about Montreal because I belong here. The Road to Now was my last monograph. However, it was not my last narrative, for I had not yet addressed the needs in the public schools. Years after my focus turned to postgraduate work, I still remembered those blank stares, the shrug of teachers' shoulders, and the apologetic glances. After the master's, I began to address the lack of Black resources in K-12. In 1999, I hooked up with Dr. Dolores Sandoval, and together we established the Da Costa Angelique Institute. We just called it DAI. The point of DAI was to develop and disseminate educational resources about Blacks in Canada. We were very focused on research, and we called DAI a think tank. What is interesting about our think tank concept was it was built around a set of ABCs of Black stories that I had been working on for Black history education in K to 12. In our first brochures, we introduced the ABCs. Eventually, our paths diverged. DAI, under Dr. Dolores Sandoval, began to agitate for an immigrant museum, or what she called an observatoire, that would allow Black artifacts to be exhibited along the histories of many other ethnic groups of Montreal. While Dolores had a grand vision for the future, my heritage efforts centered on saving Montreal's Black past. I worked in the nonprofit sector to pay the rent, but took it upon myself to identify Black document repositories in the city. The most significant was situated in the heart of downtown. For several years, I volunteered in the Black Studies Center, organizing its massive collection that dated back to the early 70s. Today, Concordia Archives is pegged to permanently preserve these community archives. Did I tell you I love archival work? Which is interesting because my doctorate is actually in library and information studies. What does LIS have to do with it? Well, the framework of my LIS research was uncovering and creating a narrative of the print heritage of the Black community. This had never been explored before. I had access to some copies of the very first Black newspaper in Montreal. Around that, I found about 198 other serials or periodicals produced by Blacks in Montreal. This number was so mind-blowing, my dissertation committee asked me to stop finding anymore. I crossed the linguistic barrier and ensured my narrative was seamless. But sadly, print culture is still an invisible segment of our historical heritage. We're an oral community, and it was exciting while I was researching to realize that Black print culture is thriving. That said, nothing has been as satisfying as saving the memory of the NCC. The NCC was arguably the most iconic Black institution in Montreal. Its physical demise is a scar that continues to hurt. Back in the early 90s, as initial efforts to revive it failed, it became clear a solution was needed to salvage the documentary remnants of the 70-year history. One Saturday, I think about 1995, somewhere around there, Nancy Morelli, Concordia's archivist, brought her team together, and we moved about 150 boxes and containers off-site for conservation. When the wall came down in April 2014, I comforted myself, knowing that these 150 boxes had been saved. Today, the history of that building and its programs and impact can be readily accessed through the archives at Concordia University. Throughout this period, I continued to visit schools. I shared the ABCs in dozens of presentations. However, it was not until I partnered up with Linton Gardner after my doctorate that much time was put into getting things published. In 2010, we planned to produce the ABCs, and those simple stories I had been drafting expanded into a kit with multiple classroom resources. The ABCs of Canadian Black History Kit was not student-centered. Rather, I decided to empower teachers so they can teach students about the accomplishments of many Black Canadians. The kit was deliberately designed to help Canadian educators become proficient and comfortable about teaching. Linton had been a school commissioner, so there was a meeting of the minds. We were convinced that many teachers wanted to teach Black history, but had no guide. They too, like their students, were miseducated, having no idea where to start, what was credible, and many were nervous about offending. This was and is the reality that tens of thousands of teachers in this country experience. I pondered several foundational issues. First, how to make Black history come alive for teachers who have had no prior introduction. Second, could we develop a resource that teachers would want to use? Third, how can the Black stories across the country, which cut through hundreds of years, be told in simple, clear language for primary school educators? These and other challenges consumed my creative energies until the kit's launch at McGill University in 2016. I think we hit it on the nose. The kit is turnkey, meaning as soon as one opens it, you can use it. No one has to go back to school to get the point. My aim was for a teacher in a one-room school in Northern Alberta with no diversity education, no personal knowledge of Blacks, to be able to feel comfortable teaching with it. I spoke to teachers, acknowledging their schedules and the challenges they faced integrating materials. The kit offered many ways to teach based upon their needs and the literacy levels of their charges. I stressed in the contents that they could be flexible and allow their students to recreate the poems and play with rap or music. I wanted the teachers to fall in love with the stories and share them readily. It was a goal to build their cultural literacy. A final peg in my efforts to counter the narrative comes from my engagement as a professor at Concordia University. Whenever I teach, students ask me why they were never taught Black history in school, or in their own words, Professor Williams, how come I did not know this before? I challenge these students to think about what is gained or who benefits by not talking about or not including Blacks in the Quebec narrative. I ask them to consider their understanding of themselves as a distinct people and how that belief might be challenged or enriched by a narrative that included the diversity that had always existed in Quebec. In my course, aptly titled Black Montreal, they learn what happens when you're not in the narrative. Students come away with newfound awareness of how knowledge and memory are constructed. Constructed histories are not exclusive to Canada. I caution them that all national histories are constructed or written to tell a single story about one tribe or a dominant group. So now when they do learn about other cultures and histories, they're much better equipped. I want them to think about and interrogate who is missing, who is silent in the narrative. I trust they will be listening. Finally, the kit incorporates many learning modalities, so educators can encourage learners to evaluate the story's explicit and implicit messages against their own ethical, moral, and/or democratic principles. And if history can inspire independent thinking and foster critical analysis, even better. Do students get this? Well, this past year, one student shared with me that she was switching to history because of what she had learned about history in my course and how the profession frames narratives. Yes, history can do that. I'm proud of what I do. I'm visible in the media and such, and people ask me, why do you do what you do? What is your goal, your agenda? I answered those questions in 2010 on the DVD I created when I reprinted Blacks in Montreal. I explained then that the answer was quite simple. I want to change Canada's narrative. Well, I often get blank stares, but you, after my speech today, you know what I mean. Well, finally, despite awards and honors along the way, I have always written for my own personal agenda. What is my agenda? Now that I've shared my secret, I will frame it a bit differently here. I need to counter the widespread perception and that lone voice that said, I, Dorothy W. Williams, the fifth of 7 generations in Canada, didn't have a history, neither in Montreal nor in Canada. And now you know, this is what lights my fire. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. That was a very stirring and inspiring talk. And I thank you very much, not just for giving the talk, but for helping all of us know important aspects of Quebec and Canadian history. Very, very significant, the work you've done. I'd like to open the floor to questions. So Brian Rock, you pointed out a question. Why don't you read it yourself?
I'll just give a background. I received a call from the Office of Parliamentary Assistant to the Premier for relations with English-speaking Quebecers, and he has also been recently appointed as Parliamentary Assistant to the Minister responsible for combating racism. And they informed me that Dorothy's ABCs of Canadian Black History have been sent to the ministry official, and read my question, and that's the follow-up for Dorothy.
Okay, so the Minister of Education and the Minister responsible for combating racism are reportedly in the process of cooperating on reforming, sorry, I read that very quickly, of reforming the curriculum in elementary and secondary schools. So Dorothy, have you been consulted yet on aiding in the reform of the curriculum regarding the history of Blacks in Quebec? Do you expect to be consulted, and when?
I have not been consulted. I don't expect to be consulted. I don't know if that's a good answer or a bad one. It tends to be the real one. I'm often informed of historical heritage issues, usually after the fact. And that's not just Quebec. I don't want to say that that's an issue for Quebec. I find also across the country that the Quebec Black story is often not included in national narratives. And they tend to be surprised when I remind them that there is a Black community in Montreal that deserves to be included in whatever the narrative is and the perspective is. So that tends to be, well, it's a totally different reason why we're not within Quebec included in that, and nationally the same effect, but from a different perspective as well. So I'd be surprised if I get a call. I'd be pleased, but I'd be surprised.
Christian Allaire has his hands up. Christian?
I found your presentation very interesting, and also I learned a lot. One of the reason I want to ask you that question is whether there is anything available in French.
Blacks in Montreal is available in French. It has been available in French. It's the publisher is Vehicule editor. They published it almost 20 years ago, probably about 20 years now. The copies are still available. It's being used at UQAM, actually, the French version, but only for one class, and only as supplemental or voluntary, not elective, sorry, that's the right word, reading. So yeah, it's, but definitely the book is available in French.
What about the material for classrooms in, let's say, high schools?
You're talking about the ABCs?
Yeah.
That's also available. Everything that I produce is in French. The only thing that has not been translated is the history book, The Road to Now. I haven't had an offer from anybody to translate that. But the entire kit that I talked about as a resource for teaching is absolutely available in French. It's been used, I know, in one private French school, and in Ontario, French schools in Ontario as well. Yes. In fact, the copy that the Premier or the Ministry of Education that Ryan Walk was talking about, they have the French version. They're not looking through an English kit.
Thank you.
Dorothy, I want to hear more about your archives and also your to use the term we're using around our office, the gray literature. So somewhere between formally published and archival. So all of the publications that you looked at for your PhD thesis. Can you tell us more? First of all, how much stuff have you got?
Oh, why are you asking me that?
Secondly, what is your legacy plan for this, Dorothy?
Oh, no. Yeah, I have quite a large, actually, I call it a collection, because when I was just doing my own collecting and materials for myself, it was an archive. But I have Richard Lord's personal and career material. I have material from the West End Sports Association, I have a bunch of other collections from people that have given me boxes of stuff, envelopes full of papers, and a lot of it I haven't even gone through. Community organizations that went defunct, and rather than throwing their papers in green garbage bags, they've heard me lecture them. So the green garbage bag would be on my front, in front of my door. So that I like to think that at least I tried to save a little bit of the documentary history and evidence that we have in the community. It's taken institutional repositories, museums, archives, decades upon centuries really, to recognize that there is other cultures that need to be captured rather than just the dominant voices. So usually when organizations went defunct, nobody wanted their papers, or somebody died and had been collecting materials over 40, 50 years of his life, his or her life, and they die, the grandkids don't care, the spouse doesn't know what to do with all the paper, and it gets thrown in the garbage. You lose, we have this expression in our community: when someone dies, the library dies, because they, in their heads, our memories and stories, incidents, and that whole thread of continuity has died with them. The only way we could capture some of that is whatever was put on paper, but if that gets thrown in the garbage, we've lost it forever. So yeah, I'm talking a bit quicker than I'm thinking, but yeah, that's why. So I have a lot of stuff. I'm still trying to organize it. But also, I think the thing that makes me most proud is the book history, which is the print culture that I told you I was studying at the doctorate level. I have, I would say thousands and thousands of copies of periodicals. I just collect everything that I find that has been produced by the Black community, over decades. So I'm very proud of that section. That's my own little baby.
Do you have plans that you can share about preserving this in some kind of institutional setting, or is that something you've considered to make?
Oh, I've considered it, and sort of played with should it go to Concordia or should it go to McGill? I'm an alum of both, I haven't answered that question yet. I love the Roy States collection at McGill, but I also see that Concordia is doing a special emphasis on Black preservation of records now. Their collection has just exploded.
Thanks, Dorothy, for the presentation. It was really inspiring. And my question is on the same wave of thought as Lorraine, is about, in fact, why don't BNQ could be interested, because, those deposits, we should consider all, the communities and diversity. So why don't you consider BNQ as, for example, as a deposit? And because those issues of security are quite important, and preservation of all this treasure is really an issue. So
actually, I had, when I was actually studying and trying to locate which repositories, including the BANQ, did they have any Black newspapers, etc. And they had several of them. I'd say about maybe 40 of them of the total. But of course, I found so much more. I don't know, maybe it would be an option. Nobody has approached me from there. I'd never really considered it. I'm just looking at the English institutions that have taken it upon themselves, because I assume at some point they're going to expand their research, their course offerings. They're going to need materials from the community. And so the archives will become an integral part of whatever professors develop. I hadn't thought of the BNQ. Thank you.
Could I ask another question, Lorraine?
Denis has his hand up and we have 3 minutes left. So how about we start with Denis and see how things go. Denis.
Excuse Alain. Dorothy, I was just curious because I work for a provincial organization. I was wondering what were the obstacles or the opportunities to look outside of Montreal? Did you ever have like leads that you decided that was just hard to get, like hard to go outside of Montreal? Or
you're talking about for the Black community collections, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's particularly in the early years, you're talking about like 98, 99% of the Black community is in Montreal. It wasn't outside the city, but that varied. But generally speaking, you're talking about a very urban phenomena within Quebec. Some of the documentary evidence of the Black presence we really see in the Quebec landscape, like Nigger Creek, Nigger Rock, things like that, which tell you at some point in the history within this region, Black people live there, right? So, but nobody has studied that. We don't have that kind of, so outside of Montreal, the identity of the Black presence is usually in the physical landscape, the civic environ, abandoned buildings, the occasional like Chemin de Liberté, I was told was after it was an underground railroad trail that had been expanded. Again, nobody has written of that. There's so many stories in Montreal still left to be told that I have not actually had the opportunity to explore outside of Montreal. And we don't have one department in this province that studies African Canadian history, in particular the Quebec. So there aren't a lot of scholars out there, and those that I do see are Toronto trained. So I have to untrain them about their, it's not all about Toronto and Windsor and St. Catharines. There were things in Montreal. So anyway, yeah, so we have a while to go. There are a lot of stories that we need to capture in Quebec, but we don't facilitate that. We meaning, I mean, it's just not there yet, but they're still debating, oh, should we have an African Canadians department at McGill? Duh, there's one in Harvard. There's one at Stanford. There's one, you name it. But should we have one here in Quebec? No. So yeah, it's hard. Being a sole scholar for many years has been, I think, one of the things that has saddened me. I see a lot more now, and Black Lives Matter. There's a lot of amateurs, untrained, but people very interested in wanting to know their history, and they're taking a stand in their communities to understand about Blacks in Montreal and Quebec and how that figures. But the trained historian, few and far between. I suggest next September, go and stand at Concordia or any of the history departments and see how many Blacks are taking history. They'll be told, like I was, that go to Western Ontario. That's what I was told. And they didn't want me to do my doctorate. Go to Western Ontario. Okay. It doesn't exist here. You're never going to get a job to teach it. So yeah, we have a long way to go.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, for your talk and for your great way of engaging the audience.